I still check the missed connections every few weeks. Not because I expect to see her name, but because I'm looking for the ad that finally explains it all. I'm looking for the person who put up the original post, the one that started the bidding war for a mahogany dining set that wasn't actually for sale. It started with a perfectly normal search. My fiancée, Sarah, and I had just moved into a small 1950s ranch house in suburban Denver, Colorado, and we were determined to furnish it with character, not particle board. I typed vintage dining table into Craigslist and found the listing. It was brief: antique dining set, mahogany, heavy, must bring help. $500 oboe. The address was only about 5 miles away, near a quiet, older neighborhood full of thick oaks and homes that had seen decades of mild winters. I called the number listed, a burner phone, I realized later, that only rang once before going straight to a full, silent voicemail box. I emailed the seller, a contact named It, and got an immediate, oddly formal reply. The item is available. Cash only. The first to arrive with payment secures the sale. The next day, a Sunday, I showed up at 9 a.m. sharp with a folded envelope of cash. The house was a dark brown split level, meticulously maintained but somehow lifeless. The only car in the driveway was an ancient, black sedan, covered in a thick layer of dust. I rang the bell. No answer. I knocked. Silence. I walked around to the backyard. That's when I noticed the other cars parked down the street. There were at least 5 of them, people sitting in their vehicles, all looking toward the same house. A few looked at me, not with curiosity, but with a strange, fixed intensity. I felt the first trickle of unease. I was supposed to be the first one here. I went back to the front door and knocked harder. This time, the door creaked open, just a few inches. Inside was a darkness that the small windows didn't dispel. A faint, cloying scent of mothballs and old wood hung in the air. "Hello?" I called out, pushing the door open a little wider. "I'm here about the dining set." The foyer was empty, but ahead, down a short hall, I saw a sliver of light from the dining room. I took a hesitant step inside. The silence of the house was not empty. It was pressurized, like the air was being held still by something heavy. I reached the dining room and froze. There was the mahogany table, exactly as pictured, enormous and dark, but around it, surrounding the table, like silent supplicants, were for other people. 2 men, 1 woman, and an elderly gentleman. They were all standing perfectly still, all looking at the table's surface. They had their wallets or envelopes of cash resting on the polished wood. One of the men, lean and wearing an expensive coat despite the mild weather, glanced at me, his eyes wide and glassy. "You're late," he whispered, his voice dry. "Late for what?" "I'm here to buy the table," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud. The other 3 didn't move. They stared at the wood. I walked closer, feeling the urge to grab the table, to stake my claim. I placed my envelope of cash down next to the others. "I've got the 500, I said, addressing the empty space above the furniture. The elderly man chuckled, a thin, papery sound. "It's not about the money, son." He pointed a shaking finger at the table's center. I finally looked down, properly. The tabletop wasn't empty. Etched into the dark, reflective wood, in what looked like hurried, fresh scratches, were 5 distinct names. My name Kevin was not among them. Beneath the names, a single word had been carefully carved, chosen. Then the floorboards upstairs groaned. A slow, heavy sound that was definitely not the settling of an old house. It was a single, deliberate footstep. All 5 of us looked up at the ceiling. The man in the expensive coat pointed to the names on the table and then, quickly, to the front door. I understood instantly. This wasn't a sale. It was an audition, a selection. As the sound of the heavy footsteps began to descend the stairs, the others started moving, not panicking, but shuffling with a terrible, desperate haste toward the exit. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my envelope off the table, the feel of the cool, heavy air rushing past me as I ran. I reached the front door and burst outside, not looking back. I sprinted down the sidewalk and jumped into my truck, cranking the ignition. As I pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror. The others were also scrambling into their cars, tires squealing as they sped off in different directions. And then, standing silhouetted in the open doorway of the silent house, I saw a figure. Tall, impossibly thin, dressed in what looked like a dark, old-fashioned suit. It didn't move. It just stood there, looking at the road where the 5 cars had just fled. As I turned the corner, I saw it raise a single, elongated hand and slowly, deliberately, touch the frame of the door. I drove until I hit the interstate, my chest heaving. I never told Sarah the full story, only that the seller was a creep. The thing is, I know that it didn't select the chosen. The people in the room knew their names were on that table before they arrived. They were already part of this horrible transaction. The question I can't shake, the one that keeps me looking at the missed connections, is this: if 5 names were already carved into the wood, and I saw 4 other people in that room, then who was the 5th one, and why did it post the ad for a table that was clearly already claimed? I don't talk to my older brother, Jason, anymore. It's not because of a fight about money or family drama. It's because of a message he sent me exactly a year ago, containing nothing but a low-resolution photo of a child's rocking horse and the text, "The sitter never showed." That horse, an old, painted wooden thing with chipped eyes, was the last thing he ever tried to sell on Craigslist. Jason and his wife had just moved to a tiny coastal town in Maine. All jagged rocks, foggy harbors, and silence. They were trying to get rid of the last bits of their city life, and one of those bits was a high-end, custom-built sauna they'd installed in their basement apartment in Portland years prior. Moving it was a nightmare, so Jason posted it for sale. Cheap, luxury 2-person cedar sauna. Disassembled. Free if you haul it today. The ad went up at 11 a.m. The reply came almost instantly, from an account with the email thecollector404. The message was terse: "I will take it. Tell me the address and when I can pick up. I bring tools and help." The address was given, and Jason mentioned he was out of town for the weekend, so he'd leave the key under the mat and the disassembled sauna parts stacked neatly in the garage. His instructions were clear. Cash payment of $200 taped to the washer, just to cover his moving costs. And please, send a text confirmation when done. Jason got the text confirmation about 6 hours later. Sauna removed. Thank you, but there was no text about the payment. When he got back home on Sunday night, the house was silent and the garage was empty. The cedar walls, the benches, the heating unit all gone. He went inside. The cash wasn't on the washer. Instead, taped neatly to the front of the dryer, was a small, white square of paper. On it, written in sharp, almost elegant script, was a single word: access. Jason was furious. He emailed the collector 404, accusing them of theft. The reply was immediate: "I paid. The terms were met. Check your inventory." Jason went through the house again. Nothing was missing, except the sauna. He sent a final, threatening email, demanding his $200. The collector simply replied, "Look harder." The exchange is complete. That night, Jason couldn't sleep. He kept feeling a subtle, intermittent coldness drifting down the hall from the kitchen. Around 3 a.m., he got up and went to the kitchen. The back door, which he'd double-bolted, was now unlocked, slightly ajar, rattling in the light sea breeze. He secured it, confused, and went back to bed, chalking it up to his own absent-mindedness. But the next night, The back door was open again. This time, he noticed something new. The high shelf in the pantry, where they kept things they rarely used, had been rearranged. The stack of old cookbooks was no longer flush with the wall. It had been pulled out by an inch or two, and a single cookbook was resting on the counter. It was The Joy of Cooking, opened to a recipe for beef Wellington. His wife hated beef Wellington. Over the next few weeks, the small, unsettling signs continued. The back door would be found unlocked almost every night. Objects would be subtly moved. A pair of reading glasses, always kept on the bedside table, would appear on the mantelpiece. A single sock from the laundry basket would be left dangling from the kitchen faucet. Nothing of value was ever taken. It was just a constant, low-frequency intrusion. Jason realized the access the buyer had purchased wasn't the cedar planks of the sauna. It was access to their private, secured space. The house. Then things escalated. Jason found a small hand-drawn map tucked inside his briefcase. It was a crude layout of their home, but with certain areas circled in red: master bed, office, basement storage, and beneath the map, written in the same elegant script as the original note, "I need the attic." Jason felt a sickening wave of certainty. The collector wasn't interested in stealing. They were interested in using the house, establishing a secondary phantom tenancy. They'd exchanged the bulk of the sauna for the access. The final incident was the rocking horse. Jason had posted it on Craigslist, a sad, last-ditch effort to offload more clutter. He came home one Tuesday to find it sitting in the center of the living room, even though he'd left it in the corner of the garage. It had a fresh, bright red satin bow tied around its neck. That night, Jason slept fitfully, constantly aware of the silence. He woke up abruptly, sure he'd heard a faint sound, a low, rhythmic creaking. It wasn't the wind. It was coming from downstairs. Heart pounding, Jason crept out of bed and descended the stairs. He paused at the living room doorway, gripping the frame. In the pale glow of the street lamp outside, he could see the rocking horse, and it was rocking, slowly, steadily, back and forth, entirely on its own. And perched on the edge of its saddle, a small, dark object that hadn't been there before. He took a shaky step closer. It was an antique silver locket. He recognized the elegant script immediately, etched faintly on the back. For the weight. Jason didn't touch it. He backed away slowly, went upstairs, woke his wife, and told her they were leaving. Now, they abandoned the house that night. They never went back. Jason deleted his Craigslist account and cut contact with anyone who might try to locate him. The last message he sent me, before blocking my number, was that picture of the rocking horse with the text, "The sitter never showed." I never knew what he meant by it, until I looked up that coastal Maine town. The local legend is about a woman who traded her possessions for safekeeping in her own house, only to find the people she traded with never left, just waited for her to go. I realized the collector wasn't selling an item. He was buying a place to stay, and the rocking horse was simply a placeholder, waiting for the next thing to be collected. I've spent the last 6 months trying to convince myself that the ad was a prank, a dark joke posted by someone who knew too much about my life in rural Montana. But the joke had a body count, and I was supposed to be number 3. It started with an impulse buy. My truck needed work, and I was scrolling the free stuff section on a Monday when I saw it. Free workshop manuals. Must take all. Late 70s and 80s models. Pickup in Red Lodge. The address was an abandoned logging mill outside of town, a place locals avoided because of the pervasive, sulfurous smell from the old processing tanks. The instructions in the ad were sparse. Gate is open. Boxers are on the loading dock. Take them and go. I drove out there late that afternoon, kicking up dust on the gravel road. The air was cold, the sky already turning bruised purple over the peaks. The chain-link gate was indeed open, flapping slightly. I pulled up to the enormous, weather-beaten warehouse. The manuals were there, stacked in 4 large, water-stained cardboard boxes on the loading dock. I opened the first box. They were exactly as advertised, grease-stained guides for everything from Chevy Novas to Ford Broncos. I started loading them into the truck, but as I lifted the third box, I realized it was heavier than the others and felt oddly dense, like it was packed with sediment. When I reached the final box, the one on the bottom, I noticed something strange about the ad. It was still up, but the title had changed. It now read, "Free Workshop Manuals. Must take all. You know the rules." I drove home and stacked the boxes in the corner of my garage. It wasn't until I started sorting through this strange, heavy box the next day that the dread truly began. Underneath a thick layer of obsolete maintenance guides, I found a stack of composition notebooks. Not new ones, but spiral-bound books filled with cramped, looping handwriting. They were ledgers. Each page was a meticulous log of dates, times, and vehicle descriptions, but instead of services rendered, there were notes like 79 Datsun pickup, broken headlight, observed at 14 o'clock, driver unaware, or 84 Oldsmobile Cutlass, cracked windshield, target located, approach pending. These weren't mechanics notes. They were surveillance logs. I threw the book back in the box, my heart racing. I pulled out another notebook. This one was different. It contained a list of names. Short, specific, first and last names, written in the same precise hand. Next to each name was a license plate number, a town, and a chilling designation, removed. There were 2 names on that list, to people who were now gone. I looked down at the third entry, the third name on the list, the one not yet marked removed. It was my name, Nathan Holt. My truck's license plate number was written next to it, Billings Mount. I felt the blood drain from my face. The ad hadn't been about the manuals. It had been about the list. I had physically retrieved the ledger containing my own death warrant. Panic set in. I drove straight back to the abandoned mill to ditch the boxers, but the chain-link gate was now locked tight with a heavy new-looking padlock. I didn't dare go back to the house. I drove 4 hours, throwing the boxers into the back of my friend's empty storage unit near Meulen, but the fear had taken root. The person who wrote that ad knew my vehicle, my name, and my town. They knew I checked the free stuff. They had delivered the final, dreadful piece of evidence directly into my hands. The next few weeks were a blur of paranoia. I changed my route to work. I slept with the lights on, and I constantly scanned my rearview mirror. One night, while sitting alone in my dark living room, I heard a noise, a dry, persistent rustling, coming from the garage. It was the sound of paper, hundreds of pages being shuffled. I crept toward the door, holding a heavy wrench. The sound stopped instantly when I was a few feet away. I waited, breathing shallowly. Then, a slow, deliberate tap against the interior garage door, like a fingertip testing the wood. Then another, then a third, softer one. I didn't open the door. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed my phone, and called the police, whispering frantically about a possible intruder. They arrived 20 minutes later. The garage was empty. Nothing was broken, no sign of forced entry. But when the deputy shined his flashlight across the floor, he found something taped to the concrete near the door, leading into the house. It was a single sheet of paper, ripped from one of those composition notebooks. The elegant handwriting was unmistakable. It read, "You should have taken them all. That was the agreement. Now you owe." Underneath the note, a small square photo was clipped to the paper. It was a picture of my truck, parked in my driveway, taken in the dead of night, and lying on the driver's seat, visible through the windshield, was one of the workshop manuals I thought I had gotten rid of. The heavy one, the one marked chosen. I hadn't taken them all. I had left one behind. and now the seller was collecting on the debt. I sold the truck the next day and moved out of state a week later, burning everything I'd brought back from the mill. Now, I live in a different state, drive a different car, and never check the classifieds. But sometimes, when the wind blows just right down an empty street, I hear that dry, quiet rustling, and I know someone is still out there, organizing their list, patiently waiting for the next free stuff post to draw in the new, unsuspecting name. I got the call last week. My old neighbor, Mrs. Albright, asked if I'd finally gotten rid of that hideous, oversized oil painting I picked up outside of Raleigh, North Carolina. I lied and said yes, because the truth that the painting is still here, and I can't move it, or even look at it anymore, is too close to what I realized about the marketplace ad. Some things aren't sold. They're simply relocated. It was a Saturday morning, and I was scrolling through Facebook Marketplace for cheap furniture to spruce up my apartment near Chapel Hill. I found a listing titled, "Massive Vintage Oil Painting. Free. Must haul. Urgent." The photo was blurry, but it showed a dark, imposing canvas, a scene of a thick, impenetrable forest, rendered in heavy, muddy strokes. It was ugly, but it had presence. The seller, listed only as MC, replied to my message instantly, providing an address 10 miles out of town, a place I recognized as being right on the edge of the sprawling state parklands. "It is heavy and must be gone today," MC insisted. "Come alone." When I arrived, the house was a neat 2-story, colonial, completely unremarkable. The painting was sitting on the front porch, leaning against the railing. It was far bigger than I had estimated, maybe 5 feet wide, and 8 feet tall, a colossal piece of work that felt too significant for a free listing. I went to the door and knocked. A woman in her late 40s, pale and wearing a bathrobe despite the hour, opened it. Her eyes were wide, and she chewed anxiously on her bottom lip. She didn't look at me. She looked past me, at the painting. "Just take it," she whispered, her voice tight with strain. "It's too much." I told her I'd need help to move it. She shook her head, her eyes still fixed on the canvas. "No, no one else touches it. You offered. You take it. It needs to leave now." Feeling a mixture of annoyance and the faint tingle of something off, I managed to muscle the painting into my pickup truck, scraping the back bumper in the process. The entire time, the woman stood in the doorway, watching me with that strange, desperate relief. The minute I secured the ropes and looked back, she was gone, and the door was silently shut. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't acquired a piece of art. I had taken something away from her that she desperately wanted gone. The painting dominated my small living room. In the daylight, it was just a murky, unsettling depiction of a deep forest. But as soon as the sun went down, the canvas seemed to absorb the light. I started to notice things. The forest wasn't just dark. It was a wall of black trees, so thick they seemed to ripple, and the texture of the paint was odd in some places. The thick impasto looked less like oil paint and more like dried earth, or maybe something organic. Then came the whispers. They weren't loud enough to be words, just a low, faint sound that seemed to emanate from the corner of the room where the painting stood. It was like dozens of hushed voices, murmuring secrets I couldn't quite catch. I started sleeping on the couch, unwilling to be in the bedroom directly across the hall from it. One evening, I came home from work and found a small pile of pine needles on my rug, directly in front of the painting. I don't have pine trees anywhere near my apartment. I vacuumed them up, convinced it was just something I tracked in. The next day, there were more. A larger pile, looking suspiciously fresh, and mixed into it were small clumps of dark, sticky dirt. I finally looked closely at the painting, and there, in the bottom right corner of the canvas, where the blackness was deepest, A tiny patch of the painted dirt looked smeared, like a finger had dragged through it. I began to realize the sounds I was hearing weren't inside the canvas. They were coming from the other side, and whatever was talking was trying to get out. The terrifying climax came on a Tuesday night. I was standing about 10 feet from the painting, trying to gather the nerve to finally take it apart and burn it. The murmuring was louder than ever, a chorus of unintelligible voices. As I watched, a section of the black sky in the top corner of the forest scene seemed to darken further. It was like a knot of shadow tightening, and then, slowly, agonizingly, a tiny section of the paint-stretched knot cracked, but stretched hand receded, forming a tiny, impossibly small aperture. I saw nothing through it, only deeper, pure blackness. But the murmuring intensified into a frantic, collective sigh, and the air in the room dropped 10 degrees. The smell of cold earth and damp leaves hit me instantly, overpowering the scent of my own apartment. It was the smell of the forest, and it was pouring into my room through that tiny, stretching hole. I knew that if I didn't get rid of it now, the hole would widen. I didn't try to move it. I didn't even touch the canvas. I simply grabbed the can of black spray paint I used for my truck, and, without thinking, I completely obliterated the canvas, painting over the tiny, pulsating opening and sealing the entire surface in thick, cheap acrylic. The murmuring stopped instantly, cut off with a wet, choked sound. The cold air vanished. Now, the painting stands in my living room, completely black, a monumental rectangle of pure, silent dread. I can't throw it out, I can't sell it, and I can't move it. I can't even touch the surface. It just stands there, a massive, oppressive shadow that seems to be waiting. Sometimes, when the apartment is completely silent, I put my ear to the black surface and hear a very faint, almost imperceptible sound, like something thin and dry tapping, 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 trying to chip its way out of the painted darkness. I don't care what the listing said. The doll wasn't vintage. It was a decoy, a terrible, silent distraction, meant to get me across the state line and onto a property that was clearly trying to lose its history. My search was simple, an authentic, mid-century wooden dollhouse for my niece's birthday. I found a great one on a regional marketplace group, listed by Phoebe's Collections, near a town called Harmony, Pennsylvania. The asking price was $50. Phoebe's messages were instant, friendly, and insistent that I pick it up quickly. "It's taking up too much room in the spare bedroom," she wrote. The address was 2 hours away, deep in the Appalachian foothills. When I finally found the road, it was little more than a muddy track leading up to a squat, gray farmhouse that looked like it had been built right into the side of a hill. The entire property was hushed. No cars, no lights, just the raw silence of the high woods closing in. I knocked, and the door opened immediately. Standing there was a young woman, maybe early 20s, with wide, watery eyes and hair pulled back tight. She didn't look like a collector. She looked like someone who hadn't slept in a week. She barely acknowledged me, just jerked her chin toward the living room. "It's over there. Take it, please." The dollhouse was beautiful, exactly as pictured, a miniature colonial masterpiece. But next to it, sitting on a low stool, was the decoy. A wooden doll, almost 2 feet tall, carved expertly, but with terrible, staring glass eyes. It wore a filthy dress and had a severe, unnatural smile. As I approached the dollhouse, I noticed Phoebe was watching the wooden doll with a fearful intensity. "I need the house," I told her, trying to keep the transaction normal, "not the doll." She didn't look at me. "He was part of the set," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The original owner said they must stay together. If you take the house, you take the doll." I hesitated. The doll was deeply creepy, but the dollhouse was perfect. I agreed, paid the $50 in cash, and started to lift the heavy dollhouse. That's when I saw the floor. The wide plank wood floor of the living room was covered in a network of fine, near-invisible scratch marks. They weren't scuffs from furniture. They were concentrated in lines, all radiating outwards from the stool where the wooden doll was perched. I looked down at the doll's heavy, flat wooden shoes. They looked perfect for scraping. Then I looked at Phoebe, who was now clutching the doorframe, her knuckles white. "Please," she choked out. I loaded both items into the trunk of my sedan, driving away quickly, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. I hadn't gone 2 miles before the quiet of the car was broken by a sound, a soft, rhythmic, almost gentle knocking. It was coming from the trunk. Not a crash, but a deliberate thump thump thump, like knuckles rapping against the interior sheet metal. I pulled over, heart hammering, and opened the trunk. The dollhouse and the wooden doll were sitting exactly where I'd put them. The doll's head was tilted sharply to the side, its glass eyes catching the faint afternoon light. I firmly pushed the doll into a corner of the trunk, secured the lid, and drove on. The knocking started again 10 minutes later, louder this time. I realized the sound was keeping pace with the car, accelerating when I accelerated, pausing when I hit a stoplight. It wasn't the dollhouse shifting. It was the rhythmic, intentional tapping of the wooden doll. When I finally reached my apartment in Pittsburgh, I ripped the trunk open. The wooden doll was now sitting right on the edge of the trunk lip, its heavy feet resting on the bumper. The dollhouse was untouched. I grabbed the doll and threw it into the far corner of my garage, then carefully moved the dollhouse inside. For the next 3 days, the doll remained in the garage, silent. I thought I had solved the problem by separating it from the house, but on the 4th day, I came home to find a new type of horror. The dollhouse was sitting on my kitchen counter, looking completely normal. But when I peered inside, I saw that the tiny, painted miniature furniture had been rearranged. The tiny chairs were overturned. The miniature beds had the small, neat blankets pulled back, and the little figures I had put inside, which were stuck to the floor with museum putty, were all lined up facing the front window. And then I noticed the scratches, fresh, minuscule scrape marks on my expensive granite countertop, radiating from the base of the dollhouse, exactly like the ones on Phoebe's floor. I knew with sickening clarity that the wooden doll wasn't the problem. It was the house. The doll was the traveler, the one that needed to be moved. The house was the anchor, and its contents and its desire for rearrangement were being dictated by something that lived inside the wood, something that needed the doll to be close to it, or it would come looking. I went to the garage. The doll was gone. In its place, sitting on the concrete floor, was a single, tiny, perfectly carved wooden shoe. The knocking is back now, not in the trunk, but in the walls of my apartment. Moving slowly, relentlessly, from the garage toward the kitchen. It's just a matter of time before the house finds its way to the doll, or the doll finds its way back to the house. I learned the hard way that some old bicycles aren't just transportation. They're the last remaining echo of something that refused to be left behind. My leg still aches, especially when the weather turns. A constant phantom reminder of the antique bicycle I bought at a flea market in rural Oregon. The ad was vague: vintage bicycle, German engineering, perfect condition, $75. It also had a strangely specific disclaimer: serious inquiries only, must come before dark. The flea market was held in a sprawling, dusty field on the outskirts of Salem. It was a chaotic symphony of vendors shouting and the smell of fried food. I found the bicycle tucked away in a dimly lit corner, beneath a sagging tarp. It was a monstrosity of a thing, a huge, heavy frame, dark green paint with thick, solid rubber tires. The handlebars were strangely wide, almost like those on an old motorcycle, and the seat was a wide leather saddle that looked almost like a small horse saddle. It didn't look German. It looked old, pre-World War II old. The seller was a tall, gaunt man with a tired face and eyes that darted nervously around the crowd. He seemed desperate to get rid of it. "It's $75, he said, his voice raspy. "But I'll take 50 if you get it out of here now." I didn't haggle. I just handed him the cash. The bike felt unnaturally heavy, almost like it was rooted to the ground. As I wheeled it toward my truck, I noticed the tires. They were a bizarre design, solid rubber, but with a series of small, raised bumps all around the tread, like miniature teeth. They weren't for grip. They looked like they were designed for something else, something I couldn't quite place. I strapped it into the bed of my pickup, and as I turned to leave, I saw the seller watching me, not with satisfaction, but with a look of profound, almost religious relief. Back home in Portland, I took it for a spin. It was an awkward ride. The bike was geared strangely, making it difficult to pedal at slow speeds, but once it picked up momentum, it felt like a silent, unstoppable force. It seemed to want to go faster, always faster. The peculiar tire treads made a faint, soft thrumming sound against the pavement, a sound that quickly became hypnotic. I started riding it everywhere, enjoying the unique sensation. That's when the incidents began. First, it was subtle. I'd be riding down a familiar street, and the bike would subtly veer, pulling me down a different, darker alley, or a quiet side street I didn't know. It was never violent, just a gentle, insistent tugging on the handlebars. I'd correct it, but it would happen again, a persistent rerouting. Then came the visions, when I rode past certain old houses, or through specific, quiet neighborhoods. I would get flashes, not full scenes, but split-second images. A child crying in an overgrown yard, a woman staring from a darkened window, a man running frantically down the street. They felt like memories, but they weren't mine. They felt like the bike's. One evening, I was riding home in the gathering dusk, and the bike veered sharply into an unfamiliar, wooded park. I tried to fight it, but the handlebars became strangely stiff, unyielding. It was like I was pedaling against a ghost. The bike picked up speed, the thrumming of the tires growing louder, deeper, almost a guttural hum. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. The bike was taking me somewhere. It felt like it knew a path that I didn't. I clutched the handlebars, my knuckles white. As the trees blurred past, the bike finally came to a halt in a small, overgrown clearing. In the center stood an ancient, rusted swing set, the chains thick with decay. And then I saw it. Buried slightly in the soft earth beneath the swing set was a small, crudely carved wooden toy horse. Its paint was peeling, and one of its wooden legs was broken. As I stared at the horse, a cold, empty feeling washed over me. I heard a faint, high-pitched giggle, not in my ears, but inside my head, like a memory being pushed into my brain. I looked back at the bicycle. The paint on its frame, which had been dark green, now seemed to shimmer with a faint, almost translucent red hue. The tires, instead of thrumming, were now making a soft, rhythmic thud-thud-thud against the damp earth, like the beating of a slow, heavy heart. I tried to dismount, to get away, but my foot slipped on the pedal, and my leg twisted awkwardly. There was a sickening snap, and a searing pain shot through my ankle. I fell to the ground, crying out. As I lay there, helpless, I saw a subtle movement from the front tire. One of the small tooth-like bumps on the tread seemed to retract and then extend, slowly, deliberately. It was like a single, blunt tooth emerging from the rubber. It slowly scraped the damp earth beside me, leaving a shallow, fresh mark. It wasn't designed for grip. It was designed for digging. The bicycle wasn't just old. It was a tool. A transport for something that wanted to be found, or perhaps for something that was trying to find a way out. I managed to drag myself away, leaving the bicycle abandoned in the clearing, my ankle throbbing with a dull, persistent ache. I called for help, and eventually, the park rangers found me. I never told them about the bike's strange behavior or the wooden horse. I just said I fell. I never went back for it. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear the ghost of that low, guttural hum, and I wonder who it belonged to. And I wonder if the bicycle is still out there, rolling silently through the forgotten paths. It's strange, tooth-like tires turning the earth, searching for its next rider, or perhaps just waiting for the right moment to reveal what it truly hides. I still check the app sometimes, not to use it, just to scroll through the profiles of the people I've already blocked, waiting for the one that says account deleted. It never does. What if I told you the most unsettling thing about online dating isn't being ghosted or catfished, but finding someone who is exactly who they say they are, and realizing they are fundamentally wrong? That's what happened with Ryan from New Jersey, a guy whose profile promised a simple, low-key evening, but whose eyes, when I finally met them, seemed to hold a flicker of perpetual, internal darkness. I went to his place in a brownstone near Hoboken, convinced it would be a harmless evening. It wasn't the guy I should have been worried about. It was the apartment itself. Ryan lived on the 4th floor of a building that looked like it hadn't been renovated since the 1950s. The air inside was thick and stale, smelling faintly of old wood and something metallic, like pennies. He was exactly his photo stall, kind of quiet and nervously polite. He told me he was a graphic designer and had only been in the apartment for about 3 weeks. We settled onto his worn olive green couch. The place was almost entirely bare. A few boxes were stacked against one wall, and the only piece of art was a strange, abstract painting of overlapping black and gray shapes that seemed to twist in the periphery. But the real issue wasn't the decor, it was the quiet. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that made the small sounds of us shifting on the couch seem deafening. When I asked about the bareness, Ryan just shrugged, a fleeting look of discomfort crossing his face. "Haven't finished unpacking," he mumbled. "It's a weird place, though. The landlord, Mr. Thorne, is a little particular." That was the first seed of wrongness, the faint, chemical scent of unease I almost dismissed as new date nerves. The evening progressed awkwardly. We tried watching a movie, but the atmosphere was too distracting. Every 10 minutes or so, I'd feel a strange, cold draft despite the windows being shut. Then, the rhythmic sound started, not loud, but persistent. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was coming from the floor directly above us. I looked at Ryan. He was staring intently at the TV, his jaw tight. I asked him, "What is that?" He paused the movie, a nervous, almost pained smile on his face. "Oh, that? Yeah, it's the upstairs neighbor. They're very active. Don't worry about it." But it wasn't foot traffic or talking. It was an unnatural, dragging sound, slow and deliberate, like something heavy being pulled across bare floorboards. It would stop for a minute, then begin again, always moving from one side of the room to the other. A little later, while Ryan was in the tiny kitchen getting us water, the sound changed. It became a low, persistent thump-thump, like a fist lightly but constantly knocking on the ceiling, right above the spot where I was sitting. It lasted for a full minute, and as soon as Ryan re-entered the living room, it abruptly stopped. When I told him, he looked sick. He told me a story about how Mr. Thorne had warned him the previous tenant of 5B had been eccentric and sometimes left things behind. but he spoke with the strained confidence of a man lying to himself more than to me. I tried to ignore it, trying to salvage the date, but the air was getting colder. I had a clear view of the dark, narrow hallway that led to the bathroom and bedroom. As I was mid-sentence, talking about my job, I saw it. A shadow. It was tall and impossibly thin, stretched out against the hallway wall, cast from some light source I couldn't see. It moved, just a slight, fluid shift, but it didn't match Ryan's shadow or mine. I froze. Ryan was still talking, oblivious. I kept my eyes fixed on the hall. The shadow solidified, becoming a silhouette of a person standing just around the corner, staring at the living room. It was unnaturally still. The silence from upstairs was back, but now the silence in Ryan's apartment felt aggressive, like the air itself was holding its breath. I finally interrupted him, my voice a whisper. "Ryan, is someone else here?" He followed my gaze to the dark hall. He went pale. "No," he breathed. "I swear. I live alone," Thorne said. He trailed off, his eyes wide. The shadowy figure shifted again, a slow, deliberate movement that made it look like it was leaning into the room, and I could swear I heard the faintest, dry sound, like whispering paper, coming from the corner. It wasn't a shadow of a person. It was the shape of one, but it seemed to drink all the light around it, making the air in the hall look visibly darker. Ryan was finally terrified. He didn't try to explain or rationalize. He just grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong, and said, "We need to go. Now." We scrambled for the door, not even bothering to grab my jacket. As we were fumbling with the deadbolt, the air pressure in the small apartment dropped suddenly, popping my ears. The sound of the drag, the constant, slow scrape from upstairs, returned, but this time it was loud, immediately above us, and it was followed by a wet, heavy thud. Then, a single, clear sound echoed from the dark hallway behind us, the sound of a key being gently inserted into the door of Ryan's bedroom. We didn't wait. We flung the front door open, stumbling out onto the landing and down the concrete stairs, not slowing until we hit the street. Ryan didn't look back. He never contacted me again. I didn't try to contact him. The next morning I drove back to Hoboken to pick up my jacket. The door to 4 Bites was slightly ajar. I pushed it open just enough to see inside. The living room was empty. No couch, no boxers, no strange painting. It was completely stripped down to the bare, dusty floorboards. The only sign that anyone had ever lived there was a small, neat pile of dark, metallic pennies sitting exactly where the corner of the rug had been. The apartment above 5B had no tenant and no history of anyone living there for over a decade. I looked up Ryan's profile a week later. It was gone. Not blocked, not deleted, just gone, like he'd never existed, leaving only the chilling, unsolved mystery of what Ryan had truly brought me to that night, and who, or what, had always been waiting for him there. The warning signs are always there, aren't they? They're always subtle, wrapped up in politeness or a bad connection. For me, the first sign was Chris's profile. It was too perfect. He was a wildlife photographer from rural Montana, the rugged, good-looking type who only used landscape shots for his pictures. Never a clear close-up of his face, which I found intriguing. He messaged immediately after we matched, bypassing the small talk. He suggested a secluded cabin he owned, a few hours outside Missoula, saying the city was too loud for him. He offered to cook me dinner. I rationalized my decision to drive out there as adventurous. That was the real mistake. It wasn't the man I should have been scrutinizing. It was the chilling blankness of the place he insisted on calling home. The cabin was deep in the woods, down a winding gravel road that felt endless. The structure itself was beautiful, dark, polished wood, and huge windows overlooking the dense pines. Chris, finally seeing him in person, was handsome, but his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. They were a watery blue, and he had an unsettling stillness about him. The cabin's interior was immaculate, almost surgically so. Everything was either a neutral gray or black, but the most striking thing was the absolute lack of personalization. There were no books, no stray papers, no coats draped over a chair, and critically, for a photographer, there wasn't a single photograph on any wall or surface. When I pointed this out, making a joke about a minimalist aesthetic, his smile disappeared. He looked down and just said, "I travel light. Things get lost." It was a hollow explanation that planted the second seed of dread, a chilling sense that this place was merely a stage, set up for a brief, temporary performance. The evening began with Chris pouring expensive wine and cooking. He was charming, talking about the isolation and the peace of the woods. But every topic we touched upon seemed to die quickly. He never elaborated on his family, his past, or his travels beyond vague generalizations. His answers were always clipped, definitive, and strangely emotionless. Then the incident started. I excused myself to use the bathroom, which was tucked into a dark hallway. As I opened the door, I caught a glimpse of something on the floor in the corner of the hallway, a dark, damp footprint. It wasn't shaped like a boot or a shoe. It was wider than a human foot, and the 3 toes were unnaturally long, like talons. I blinked, and the shadow of the hallway seemed to absorb it, making it vanish. I convinced myself the wine was playing tricks on me. When I came back out, Chris was standing stock still in the middle of the living room, staring out the vast picture window into the black woods, and he didn't react until I was right next to him. He turned, his face expressionless, and for a split second, I didn't recognize him. It was like the life had been momentarily sucked out of him. Later, while we were sitting by the fireplace, the true auditory terror began. It was a sound from outside, deep in the tree line, a sound that wasn't quite a howl. Not exactly a moan, but something in between a strained, wet vocalization, like a creature in agony trying to form words. It was distant, but it cut through the silence of the woods like a knife. Chris reacted instantly. He froze, his head cocked, listening with an intensity that suggested immediate recognition. "What was that?" I whispered, my blood turning to ice. He refused to look at me. "Just a coyote. They get restless this time of year," he said, but his voice was thin and shaky, devoid of conviction. The sound returned, closer this time, and it was undeniably repeating a rhythmic pattern, 3 short, rising cries followed by a single, drawn-out groan. It sounded like something attempting to mimic distress. Then, Chris got up and without a word, walked over to a steel cabinet hidden in the shadows near the kitchen. He opened it, revealing not plates or pantry items, but a collection of heavy-duty locks, chains, and a massive dull silver bolt-action rifle. He didn't take anything out, he just stood there, looking at them. His back to me, the silence that followed was broken by a new, horrifying sound. It wasn't outside, it was coming from under the house. A low, grinding sound, accompanied by a faint, chemical smell like bleach mixed with iron, that began to fill the room. The grinding seemed to move, slow and heavy, right underneath the wooden floorboards where I was sitting. It was then I noticed Chris wasn't looking out the main window anymore. He was looking at the single, small, reinforced window in the pantry area, a window far too high and small to see out of. I followed his gaze and pressed against the exterior glass, lit dimly by the interior light, was a pale, long hand. It was too large to be a woman's and too slender to be a man's, with fingers that seemed to have one too many joints. It didn't tap or knock. It just pressed flat against the glass, and for a chilling moment, the fingers seemed to slowly flex, dragging moisture down the pane Chris slammed the cabinet shut, his eyes finally locking onto mine, and they were no longer vague. They were filled with a desperate, animal fear. "Go," he choked out, pushing me toward the front door. "Don't look back. Don't stop driving. Don't say anything to anyone." I didn't need to be told twice. I sprinted to my car, fumbling the key into the ignition. As I turned the car around on the gravel, my headlights briefly swept across the back of the cabin. That's when I saw the foundation. The cabin was built on tall stone pillars, and in the small, deep shadow of the crawl space, I saw a movement. It was a person, or something the size of one, low to the ground, pulling themselves quickly and fluidly on their stomach, dragging something heavy and indistinct behind them into the shadows. I drove until the gravel road turned to asphalt, and then until the sun was up. I never heard from Chris again. His Tinder profile vanished the following day. I contacted the local sheriff's department in Missoula about the area, claiming I was house hunting, and they told me that particular cabin had been the site of a single, highly publicized disappearance 5 years prior, an event the owner had been desperate to erase from local memory. I never figured out what was under the house, or what Chris was photographing, or if he was simply trying to keep me away from whatever it was that demanded a life lived with no pictures and a silent, terrifying devotion. I only know I saw what he was running from, and whatever it was, it had learned to use a phone. It started with a perfectly normal message. "Hey, saw your profile. You like obscure indie films too?" That was Marc. His profile picture was friendly, unassuming, a casual selfie in front of a bookstore in Brooklyn. We chatted for a few days, seemed to hit it off, and eventually, he invited me over to his place in a pre-war building in Astoria, Queens, for a movie night. It was supposed to be a cozy, no-pressure first date. Instead, it became an education in how silence can be weaponized, and how some apartments, like some people, are not just empty, but deliberately hollowed out. I should have paid more attention to the lingering feeling of being watched, not by Marc, but by the very walls of his apartment. Marc's building was old, with a creaky elevator that smelled of dust and forgotten meals. His apartment, 7C, was small, but tastefully furnished a comfortable couch, a decent TV, a small dining table. Standard, New York living. Marc himself was exactly as he appeared in his photos, pleasant, a little shy, with kind eyes. We ordered pizza, put on a movie, and settled in. Everything felt normal, comfortable, almost boring. But after about an hour, the first anomaly appeared, a faint, almost imperceptible echo. It wasn't the kind you get in an empty room. It was like my own voice, or Marc's, had a tiny, delayed shadow. If I cleared my throat, I'd hear a faint, distant hum from somewhere within the apartment, just a fraction of a second later. I dismissed it as old building quirks. Yet, a subtle seed of unease was planted. A quiet hum in the back of my mind that whispered, "Something here is off-kilter." The movie played, and as the evening darkened, the apartment seemed to grow heavier. Marc wasn't a big talker, which at first I attributed to shyness, but his silences were deep, profound, sometimes lasting minutes. Even when I asked a direct question, he would just stare past me, his expression blank, before snapping back and giving a short, generic answer. Then the echoing became more pronounced. It wasn't just our voices now. When a character on screen would utter a sharp word, I'd hear a tsk or a clack from somewhere near the back of the apartment, a faint but distinct replica. When I mentioned it, Marc gave a tight, almost forced laugh. Thin walls, I guess. My neighbors are always busy, but the sounds weren't coming from the sides. They seemed to emanate from within his apartment itself, specifically from a closed, unmarked door at the very end of a short, dark hallway near the kitchen. a door that looked suspiciously like it led to a second bedroom. As the night wore on, the apartment got colder, despite the heat being on. I could feel a constant, subtle draft, not from a window, but from that back hallway. The echoes escalated from faint imitations to distinct, chilling repetitions. I dropped my fork on the hardwood floor with a sharp clink. Almost immediately, a dull, metallic clank came from behind that door. It was no longer subtle. Marc, sitting next to me, seemed oblivious, engrossed in the movie, though I noticed his shoulders were strangely tense, almost hunched. A few minutes later, the movie had a jump scare, and I involuntarily let out a small, sharp gasp. From behind the door, a split second later, came an identical, sharp intake of breath, a soft, wet hiss that sent shivers down my spine. I looked at Marc. His eyes were wide, fixed on the screen, but his hands were clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. He was definitely hearing it. He was choosing to ignore it. The atmosphere wasn't just cold. It was thick, charged with a silent, unseen presence. It felt like something was mimicking us, just out of sight, and learning. Suddenly, the electricity flickered, plunging the apartment into near darkness, before returning a second later. In that brief moment of pitch black, a new sound cut through the silence, a series of rapid, desperate scratches against the inside of that closed back door. They were frantic, like an animal trapped, trying to claw its way out. Marc jumped, finally breaking his composure. He looked at the door, then at me, his face a mask of terror. I think you should go, he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Before I could even respond, the scratching stopped. It was replaced by something far worse. A slow, deliberate thud, 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 coming from directly behind the door, moving slowly from one side of the room to the other. It sounded like something, heavy and soft, being dragged across a carpeted floor. Then, from the very bottom of the door, just above the floorboards, a thin, sickly yellow liquid began to seep out, slowly forming a small puddle on the dark wood. It smelled faintly of cleaning solution and something metallic, like stale blood. I didn't wait for an explanation. I grabbed my bag and stumbled for the front door, my heart pounding. Marc didn't try to stop me. He just sat frozen on the couch, staring at the spreading yellow stain, his face utterly devoid of hope. As I wrestled with the lock, I heard it one last time. Not an echo, but a new, clear sound from behind that door. A low, guttural giggle, not quite human, followed by the distinct schlick of a deadbolt sliding into place from the inside. The apartment's front door finally opened, and I fled down the hall, hearing Marc's strained, broken voice from inside. "No, don't please," as the door to apartment 7C, slowly, silently, swung shut behind me. I moved out of Astoria a month later. I never saw Marc or his profile again. I looked up his building online, searched for news, but found nothing. There was no record of a second tenant in 7C, nor any reports of disturbances. I still, occasionally, hear a faint echo of my own voice when I'm alone in a quiet room, a chilling reminder of the presence that was so carefully hidden, yet so desperately trying to break free. Marc wasn't just lonely. He was a gatekeeper, and whatever was behind that door wasn't just echoing his life, it was trying to take it. My career requires me to travel constantly across the US, and I've stayed in every kind of establishment, from roadside motels to luxury chains. But the one place that shattered my understanding of reality was the Blackwood Hotel in Richmond, Virginia. It's a grand, century-old building, all dark oak and tarnished brass, known locally for its faded glory and persistent rumors of former theatrical residents who never checked out. I was there for a week-long conference and was assigned to room 411. I'm a rational man. I believe in physics and logic, but what happened in that room convinced me that some energies linger long after the curtains close. The hotel itself was heavy with silence, smelling of dust and expensive old carpet. Room 411 was spacious, with high ceilings and a colossal four-poster bed. The moment I walked in, I felt an oppressive, concentrated cold near the small decorative fireplace. Even though it was summer outside, the feeling wasn't exactly threatening. It was more like being acutely observed. I set my briefcase down and immediately noticed the antique vanity mirror. It was huge, framed in dark, intricate wood, and it felt too dominant, catching the room's light in a way that made every corner seem just slightly shadowed. I tried to shake the feeling, rationalizing it as the effect of the hotel's age. But the initial cold greeting in room 411 was the first subtle warning that I was not alone. The strange occurrences began on the second night. I woke up sharply at 3:15 a.m., not from a dream, but from the sound of someone quietly clearing their throat right beside the bed. I shot upright, heart hammering, but the room was dark and silent. I checked the doors, the windows, everything was secure. The next morning, I noticed a detail I'd missed. The framed print hanging over the fireplace was tilted at a severe, unnatural angle, almost 45 degrees. I straightened it, but 20 minutes later, returning from a quick trip to the lobby, it was tilted again. This wasn't prankster stuff. The tilt was too precise, too aggressive for a draft. Later that evening, while reviewing notes at the small desk, I became aware of a new sound, a slow, rhythmic tap-tap-tap coming from the bathroom. Always 3 taps, separated by silence, like someone meticulously filing their nails. I got up, opened the bathroom door. The room was empty, the light off, and the tapping instantly ceased. The third night was when the paranoia fully set in. I went to bed, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt a distinct pressure on the edge of the mattress. A slight indentation, as if someone heavy was sitting there, studying me. I kept opening my eyes, seeing nothing but the heavy shadows. Then, I heard a new, deeply unnerving sound, originating from the huge vanity mirror. It was a very low, almost inaudible humming, a single, resonant note that seemed to vibrate in the air around my head. It sounded like a woman's voice, not singing a tune, but sustaining one, unwavering, deeply melancholic note. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and pointed it at the mirror. As soon as the light hit the glass, the humming stopped, but reflected in the center of the mirror, which was otherwise perfectly clear, was a tiny, distinct patch of condensation, like breath on a cold day, just for a moment, and then it was gone. On the final night of my stay, the activity reached its chilling peak. I had intentionally left the vanity mirror covered with a bath towel, hoping to block whatever energy was focusing there. I woke up suddenly, breathless, feeling the immediate, intense cold that heralded its presence. The towel was lying on the floor. I didn't see anything, but I could smell a faint, sharp scent of lavender and old stage makeup. I was too scared to move. Then, the door to the closet, which I'd meticulously checked and secured, slowly began to open, inch by quiet inch. I watched, frozen in the bed, as a shadow began to stretch out of the opening. It wasn't a solid shape, but a wavering, elongated column of absolute blackness. The air was now so cold that I felt a sharp pain in my head as the shadow stretched toward the bed. The humming returned, louder this time, not a single note, but a rising, vibrating crescendo that made the glass in the windows tremble. Suddenly, the shadow coalesced near the foot of the bed, and a low, dry voice, sounding like brittle silk, whispered directly into the silence, "You're a terrible audience." At that same instant, the antique clock on the bedside table spun violently, shattering its glass face, and a single, heavy objecta, solid brass, drawer pull from the desk flew across the room and smashed into the vanity mirror with incredible force, leaving a single, radiating starburst crack. I vaulted out of bed and ran, not stopping until I was out of the room, leaving my unpacked bags behind. I checked out at 4:30 a.m., telling the sleepy clerk I had an early flight. I never returned for my things. I later researched the Blackwood Hotel's history and found an article about a tragic local actress who had committed suicide in room 411 in the 1920s after a career-ending performance. Her death was attributed to poisoning, often associated with a lavender scent. The haunting isn't about being hurt, it's about being judged. To this day, the thought of that fragmented mirror and that whispering voice fills me with a cold, hollow dread. She was looking for applause, and all I could give her was my fear. I was driving cross-country, moving from Arizona to Massachusetts, and I stopped for the night in a small, out-of-the-way town in Ohio, drawn by the name of a place I found online, the Palmer House. It was advertised as a historic landmark, a grand old roadside hotel that felt like a relic from the 1930s. When I pulled up, it looked less historic and more deeply neglected. Still, I was tired and paid cash to the woman at the front desk, whose face was pale and whose eyes seemed too large. She gave me the key to room 309 on the 3rd floor. She paused, looking down at the heavy brass key, and quietly added, "The 3rd floor is always quiet this time of year. Be sure to check the lock." That cryptic, unnecessary advice was the first chill, the small crack in the veneer of normalcy that I should have paid much closer attention to. Room 309 was small and overheated, with heavy curtains that blocked out most of the sun. The wallpaper was a sickly floral pattern that seemed to crawl in the poor light, but the room itself felt empty, save for the pervasive smell of wood smoke and something else, something sharp and clean, like ammonia. I planned to get up early, so I set my alarm, plugged in my phone to charge on the bedside table, and passed out. When I woke up, the room was dark. My internal clock screamed that it was too late, but my phone screen was black. I reached for the lamp switch. It didn't work. I finally found the bedside clock, a cheap digital model, and its display was dark. I checked the phone. It was fully charged but wouldn't turn on. I had no idea what time it was, and the silence from the hallway outside was absolute, a deadening void that made the small room feel like a vacuum. That lack of light and time was the true beginning of the dread. I managed to find the door and stumbled into the hallway. The 3rd floor hallway was impossibly long and dim, illuminated only by a single, flickering fluorescent tube at the far end. My footsteps on the thin carpet sounded unnaturally loud. I was looking for an ice machine, or maybe just a working clock, when I noticed something strange about the doors. They all looked the same heavy dark wood, but they were all numbered sequentially until I reached a gap. Between room 307 and 309, there was an unmarked door. It was the same size and shape, but it had no number, no handle, and no keyhole. It was just a seamless dark plane in the wall. As I walked past it, I distinctly heard a sound from the other side, a slow, dragging sound, followed by the faint, rhythmic squeak creak of an old rocking chair. I froze, my heart racing, and the sounds abruptly stopped. I quickly rationalized it as sounds from other rooms bleeding through, but the door's blankness felt like a conscious concealment. I started walking toward the working light at the end of the hall, and that's when the hallway began to change. I looked down at the carpet. The floral pattern that covered the floor seemed to shift subtly in the flickering light, becoming denser and darker, like stains were blooming on the fabric. I sped up, passing another set of doors, and suddenly, my reflection in the dark, lacquered wood of a doorframe looked wrong. It wasn't MIT, was a slightly shorter figure, wearing clothing that looked like it was from the 1930s, a dark, bulky suit. I spun around, seeing nothing but the empty hall behind me, and when I turned back to the door, my own reflection was back. But now it looked exhausted and terrified. The air temperature dropped so sharply, it felt like walking into a meat locker. I was nearing the end of the hall, desperate for the elevator, when I heard it, a low, mournful, constant weeping coming from behind room 315. It wasn't loud, but it was raw and utterly without hope, a sound of profound despair. I stopped, and the weeping immediately transformed into a clear, dry whisper that seemed to float directly down the hallway toward me, saying my name, David. You shouldn't have stopped here. It was a voice I didn't recognize, raspy and dry, like old paper. As the whisper faded, I looked up and saw that the single light at the end of the hall had died, plunging the far end into total, suffocating darkness. The only light was a dim wash coming from my room, 309, far behind me. I realized with sickening clarity that the elevator must have been right where that blank door was located. I had walked too far. I spun around and ran back toward the dim light of room 309. But as I ran, I heard the sounds return, amplified and distorted. The sound of the rocking chair was now frantic, violent, as if someone was throwing their weight into it. And from behind the unmarked door, a heavy object slammed against the wood, sending a deep, resonant thrum through the floor. I slammed the door to 309 shut, fumbling for the key. As I jammed it in, I heard a wet, rapid tapping on the other side of the door, just above the peephole, and a low, frantic scratching that was trying to find a purchase on the smooth wood. I stood with my back against the door until morning, when the sunlight finally pierced the heavy curtains. The phone, the clock, and the lamp all flickered back to life, showing the exact time, 7 a.m. I packed my bag in less than 5 minutes and fled. I didn't stop at the desk. I just dropped the key on the counter and walked out. I later found a historical article about the Palmer House, detailing a fire on the 3rd floor in 1937 that consumed the central wing, including the main staircase and the room of a distressed guest who was staying in room 308. There is no room 308 in the hotel now, just that solid, unmarked wall. I drove away that morning, leaving the silence of the Palmer House behind, forever haunted by the terrifying realization that I hadn't been lost in a hotel hallway, had been walking through a piece of time that simply refused to let me pass. My friend Lisa and I took a road trip through the Southwest, and our last stop before heading home was the Desert Queen Motel outside of Las Cruces, New Mexico. It was a classic 1950s motor court single-story, U-shaped buildings surrounding a faded pool. The place was nearly deserted. The check-in was handled by a frail, silent man who just slid a keycard across the counter for room 12. As we walked to the room, the desert air felt suffocatingly still, and the peeling paint and broken neon signs suggested that the motel had died years ago, even if its structure hadn't fully collapsed. The first sign of real wrongness was a bizarrely placed object right outside our door. There was an old, tarnished metal box mounted on the wall, about the size of a shoebox. It was clearly an antique intercom unit, complete with a small speaker grill and a single, rusted push button. It looked like it hadn't worked in decades, but it radiated a low, almost vibrating heat. Room 12 was sparse, with 2 stiff beds and a cracked tile bathroom. The moment we dropped our bags, the air felt thick, heavy with an almost palpable sadness. The rest of the afternoon was normal, but once the sun dropped, plunging the desert into a cold, immediate darkness, the atmosphere in the room changed. We were sitting on the beds, scrolling on our phones, when a sound from the wall unit outside startled us. It was a short, sharp electronic bzzzt. That cut through the silence. We exchanged a look, and Lisa went to the window, pulling the curtain aside. The area outside was empty. We convinced ourselves it was a short in the old electrical system. But the sound wasn't random, it was rhythmic. About every 5 minutes, that single, loud BZZT would ring out from the intercom. It was annoying, but the unnerving part was the absolute silence that followed each one. It was like a notification that no one was answering. The rhythm eventually wore us down, and we decided to try and sleep. Around 2 a.m., the BZZT changed. Instead of the static-laden buzz, it became a clear, distinct, ding-dong sound, exactly like an old-fashioned doorbell. It only happened once. The silence that followed was instant and total. Then, from the speaker grill of the unit outside our door, we heard a sound that turned my stomach to ice. The distinct, low, wet sound of someone taking a deep, shuddering breath. It wasn't a mechanical sound. It was organic. We were both sitting bolt upright in bed, listening. Lisa whispered, "Someone's out there." I crept to the window, peered through the gap in the curtains, and saw nothing. The light outside was out, leaving only deep shadows. I went to the door and pressed my ear to the wood, trying to hear footsteps. Nothing. But then, the intercom spoke. It was a woman's voice, very close to the unit, but muffled, as if she was speaking into a handkerchief. The voice was strained and ragged, sounding profoundly exhausted, and it simply said, "Room 12. Please let me know if he comes back." The sound was so quiet, so desperately close, that it seemed to come from inside the door itself. I frantically checked the deadbolt and the chain, my hands shaking. I felt a wave of icy cold wash over me, concentrating right where my ear was pressed against the wood. I backed away, stumbling over a shoe, and that small noise seemed to trigger the entity. The intercom unit outside began to buzz and chatter wildly, a chorus of loud, rapid static that sounded like dozens of voices speaking at once. Through the noise, we could both hear a new sound, a sound of heavy, deliberate running, passing rapidly right in front of our door, the slap of old leather soles on dry concrete. The footsteps stopped abruptly, right outside room 14, 2 doors down. The static on our intercom instantly vanished. It was replaced by the low, strained voice of the woman again, sounding even closer and more desperate this time. He's in 14 now." I heard the lock turn. "Please, hurry." I knew with chilling certainty that whatever was outside wasn't physically there. And whatever he was, it was terrifying her. Lisa and I scrambled for our keys and bags. As we were unlocking the door, preparing to make a break for the car, the intercom outside made a final, horrifying sound. It wasn't a buzz or a voice. It was the sustained, high-pitched shriek of pure, agonizing terror, cut short by a sickening thud, and then an immediate, absolute silence. We yanked the door open, ready to run, but stopped dead. The hallway was empty. There was nothing, except for the tiny, rusted intercom unit mounted on the wall. But stuck to the speaker grill was a single, tiny wisp of dark, silky hair. Too fine to be ours. We drove non-stop until we hit the next state. I later discovered through a very old, dusty newspaper article that the Desert Queen was the site of a tragic incident in 1963. A woman staying in room 12 had been murdered by her husband after he tracked her down. The most disturbing detail: her name was Maria. The article also mentioned a faulty intercom system that had been disabled after guests in adjacent rooms complained about hearing desperate calls for help that no one could trace. I never figured out who was running toward room 14 or why the intercom was only speaking to us. I only know that the Desert Queen is less a motel and more a trap, forever reliving one dark night and still begging for someone, anyone, to pick up the call. I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the lockbox code didn't match the one the host had sent. It wasn't the kind of wrong that causes alarm, but the kind that causes a tiny, cold knot in your stomach, a sudden, deep-seated sense that you've stepped into a sequence of events you can't control. The host, Sarah, had promised a peaceful weekend getaway in the woods of rural Vermont. A rustic cabin escape from the city. I was standing on the porch of a beautiful but isolated A-frame, surrounded by nothing but towering pines and the silence of a deep valley, and the numbers just wouldn't work. After 10 minutes of increasingly frantic attempts, I realized someone had changed the code since the last booking. But Sarah swore she hadn't. That's when the cabin door, right behind the flimsy lockbox, slowly, silently, clicked open. The cabin itself was exactly as advertised, vintage, cozy, and tucked away in the kind of serene isolation I craved. It was late September, and the air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. I was a freelance writer seeking peace to finish a manuscript, and this place, just outside of Bennington, seemed perfect. I managed to reach Sarah on a spotty cell connection, and she was apologetic, insisting the door must have been left ajar by the cleaning crew. She told me to go in and wait for her to call back with a new code for the box so I could secure my spare key. Inside, the main room was dominated by a stone fireplace and a wall of windows looking out into the dense forest. I set my bags down, and that's when I noticed the details that started to fray the edges of my calm. There were 5 framed photographs on the mantel. In every single one, a different, smiling person stood in the exact spot I was standing now, near the fireplace. They weren't family photos. They were like professional portraits, and something about their poses too cheerful, too stiff felt rehearsed. Then, on the small kitchen table, sitting next to a complimentary bottle of wine, was a spiral-bound guest book. Not a digital one, but a thick, leather-bound journal. I picked it up, and the first entry, dated 3 days ago, simply read, "The woods are watching." I shouldn't have opened the blinds. The first night was tolerable, if a little strange. The isolation magnified every natural sound, turning a falling acorn into a gunshot. I found myself checking the windows constantly, but the escalating dread started the next morning. I was making coffee when I noticed something missing. I had left my laptop on the kitchen counter, next to a stack of research notes. The notes were still there, untouched, but the laptop was gone. I searched everywhere, tearing the cabin apart. It wasn't until I checked the porch that I found it, sitting neatly on the doormat, completely exposed to the dew and the morning chill. It was open to the desktop, the screen displaying a single file folder I didn't recognize, labeled only Logs. I brought it inside, heart pounding, and clicked it open. Inside were a dozen short video files, each only a few seconds long. They were all silent, grainy clips, but the content was sickeningly clear. They were all recorded from a camera hidden inside the cabin, documenting my actions from the moment I arrived. The first clip showed me struggling with the lockbox. The latest showed me asleep in bed, the camera positioned high on a shelf, facing the pillow. It didn't feel like a host's mistake. It felt deliberate, a display of ownership over my privacy. I immediately called Sarah, but the only response was a robotic voicemail that cut out mid-sentence. The next few hours were a blur of growing panic. I tried to leave, but as I walked toward my car, I saw the 4 tires were flat, not slashed, but slowly, meticulously deflated, the valve stems removed and placed on the hood. I was trapped. I went back inside, locking the door and trying to maintain some semblance of logic. Maybe it was a prank, a sick neighbor. But then the photographs on the mantel started to change. I'm certain there were 5 when I arrived. Now there were 6. The newest photo was identical in style to the others, brightly lit, professionally framed, but the person in it was me. It was a picture of me sleeping from the logs folder, now printed and framed, added to the collection. I backed away slowly, my breath catching in my throat, realizing that the logs were not files someone had left for me to find, but proof of an ongoing surveillance. I frantically searched the room again for hidden cameras. I was on my hands and knees, checking under the sofa when I heard the sound. It was coming from the ventilation shaft above the fireplace, a low, rhythmic tapping, like knuckles on plaster. I froze, my gaze locked on the vent. The tapping stopped. Then, a sound I can only describe as a wet, ragged whisper came through the grate. It wasn't words. It was a person clearing their throat, right there, above me, in the silent, empty house. The climax arrived minutes later. I was huddled on the floor, phone in hand, desperately trying to dial 911, despite the failing signal. The tapping returned, louder now, and faster, a drumbeat of dread. The air vent rattled violently, and a fine dust drifted down. Then, the front door, which I had secured with a kitchen chair wedged under the knob, began to shake. Not violently, but with a slow, deliberate pressure. Like something heavy was leaning its full weight against it from the outside. The chair groaned. I didn't look at the door. I looked at the my picture frame on the mantel. And that's when I noticed the small, almost invisible detail in the photograph of me sleeping. A shadowy, indistinct reflection in the window beside the bed. It wasn't the camera's lens. It was a figure, tall and dark, standing just outside the glass, watching. The chair under the doorknob splintered with a sharp crack, and the door was pressed inward an inch, revealing the blackness of the porch. I didn't think. I ran. I shattered the back window with a chair leg and scrambled out, tearing my hands on the glass, not caring about the cuts. I didn't look back at the A-frame, its dark windows staring out like blind eyes into the forest. I ran 4 miles through the cold pre-dawn woods, guided only by the distant, pale light of the rising sun. I made it to a gas station on a state highway, hysterical, bloody, and freezing. The police found the cabin exactly as I described. The door was forced open, the back window was shattered, but everything else was neat. The photographs were gone from the mantel, and the logs file on my laptop had been deleted. The guest book was still on the table, but the last entry had been torn out. The police called it a possible home invasion attempt. Sarah, the host, never responded to their inquiries, but every few months, I get a notification from an unknown, untraceable email address. It's always a single, high-resolution photograph, and every single time, it's a picture of a different A-frame cabin, somewhere in the US, with a single, unfamiliar car parked outside. It's always accompanied by a one-word subject line, vacant. There is an emptiness that doesn't just lack noise, but actively absorbs it. I found that emptiness outside of Roswell, New Mexico, where the desert stretches out like a faded, endless photograph. It was an Airbnb advertised as a modern desert retreat. All concrete floors and floor-to-ceiling glass, but it was 3 hours from the city and utterly silent. The moment I stepped out of the rental car, the wind died, and a profound stillness settled. My first thought wasn't about aliens or mysteries. It was simply that something huge was missing. The quiet felt heavy, and then, as I was keying in the code, I saw it. Carved roughly into the bleached wood of the door frame, at eye level, was a single, deep line. It looked less like vandalism and more like a tick mark, a primitive score. My plan was simple: 2 weeks of solitude to recharge after a bad breakup. The house was strikingly minimalist. White walls, a single piece of abstract art, and the panoramic windows that made the vast, empty landscape the only real decoration. The host, a man named Carl, had been extremely clear in his welcome message. The water pump is old. If you hear a thumping sound at night, ignore it. It's just the pump cycling. Also, The Wi-Fi is spotty. I advise you to enjoy the quiet. I took a walk around the perimeter the first evening. Just as the sun was setting and painting the sky with impossible shades of orange and purple, that's when I saw the second mark. It was on the back railing of the deck, another deep, horizontal gash, identical to the one on the doorframe. I ran my thumb over it. The wood felt freshly gouged. I reasoned, it must be some kind of idiosyncratic marking system Carl used for maintenance, but a chill had begun to seep into my bones. Unrelated to the cooling desert air, the subtle escalating began that very night. I was asleep, having finally succumbed to the oppressive quiet, when the distinct sound of the water pump, a dull, rhythmic thump, 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 woke me up. But it wasn't coming from the laundry room where I knew the pump was. It was coming from the master bathroom, specifically, the linen closet. I got out of bed, rationalizing that the pipes must be rerouting the sound. I opened the linen closet door. It was empty, save for a few folded towels. The thumping stopped immediately. I sighed, feeling foolish, and went back to bed. However, 30 minutes later, it started again, this time undeniably coming from inside the kitchen cabinets. I went into the kitchen. The thumping was muffled, like a heavy, soft weight being dragged or dropped repeatedly. I opened the cabinet. Nothing. I closed it. Thump, thump, thump. I opened the next cabinet. Silence. I repeated this 4 times until I realized the source of the noise wasn't a cabinet. It was the act of opening the cabinet that made it stop. Whatever was making the sound seemed to pause whenever I acknowledged its presence. This went on until dawn, with the thumping migrating silently from room to room, always starting again just as I settled back down. By the time the sun rose, I was exhausted and deeply unnerved. The fear solidified the next day. I had deliberately avoided going outside, choosing instead to stare out the enormous windows at the unchanging desert vista. But as I was wiping down the counter, I saw another mark. It was not on wood this time, but on the white porcelain of the kitchen sink basin. A scratch so deep it was almost black against the glaze. It was the 3rd tick mark, and then the 4th. I found it in the middle of the large, bare concrete floor of the living room, a score that looked like someone had dragged a cinder block across the surface, leaving a perfectly straight, short line. My mind, desperate for a logical answer, went back to Carl's message. The one thing he had advised me to do was ignore the thumping pump. But what if the sound wasn't a pump at all? What if it was something else, something that didn't like being acknowledged? The terror was in the realization that the markings were a countdown, or perhaps a ledger, a list being kept, 1 mark for every night I had stayed. I went back to the front door, pulling it open. I looked at the first mark, then at the desolate landscape. I was 2 days into my reservation, and I had found 4 distinct, fresh marks. The math didn't add up, and the conclusion was terrifying. The marks weren't counting my days. They were counting something else's activity. The feeling of being watched was no longer a vague paranoia. It was a certainty. I pressed my face close to the floor-to-ceiling window, trying to pierce the reflection and see out, when I noticed something reflecting in the glass from the inside of the room, behind me. A low, distorted reflection, too close to the glass, too large to be mine. The climax was an instant of pure, frozen panic. I whirled around, heart leaping into my throat. There was nothing there, but the house was now vibrating with the intensity of the sound. The thumping was back, not in one location, but seemingly everywhere, simultaneously, coming from the walls, the ceiling, and the floor. It was like a colossal, invisible heartbeat had enveloped the building. A low, wet, powerful boom 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 that resonated in my chest. The light fixture above the dining table began to swing back and forth, slowly at first, then accelerating into a frantic pendulum. The 5th mark was revealed in that moment. Scratched into the reflective metal surface of the refrigerator door, the newest and deepest of them all. I saw a movement in the hallway, a flicker of shadow that was denser than the shadows around it. It wasn't a figure, but a wave of profound wrongness that seemed to crawl along the concrete floor toward me. In a blind surge of adrenaline, I snatched my car keys and flung myself toward the sliding glass door. I wrenched it open and bolted out into the cooling desert night. The thumping sound instantly cut off by the dry, dead silence of the outdoors. I drove until the odometer read 150 miles, not stopping until I hit the lights of a truck stop. I finally called Carl the next day. He answered with a weary sigh. I told him everything: the thumping, the marks, the picture on the door. He didn't sound surprised. He simply said, "Oh, the old pump's been acting up for years. I told you to ignore it." I demanded to know about the markings. There was a pause. Then, a dry, almost amused chuckle. "You mean the score marks?" "Yeah. My last tenant was a contractor. Said the house kept track of how many days he lasted before he packed up. Said he never understood why the numbers didn't match the days either." I hung up, my hand shaking violently. It wasn't until I was back home, days later, reviewing my own rental photos, that I noticed a final, chilling detail. In the picture of the front door I took when I arrived, there was only one mark. I had been the first to notice the ledger, and on the last night, as I drove away, I looked in my rearview mirror. The house was a dark, silent silhouette in the distance. But for a brief moment, I saw a pale, single light switch on, then off, in the exact position of the linen closet. And I know, with absolute certainty, that on the doorframe, a sixth, new tick mark has now been added. The listing promised a vintage, centrally located townhome in historic Savannah, Georgia, but the description left out a crucial detail: the smell. It was a dense, cloying odor of damp earth and something sweet, like decaying flowers that seemed to cling to the walls themselves. My wife and I, exhausted from the cross-country drive, barely noticed it at first, but when I unlocked the front door and pushed it open, a gust of cool, thick air hit me, and the smell intensified, feeling less like something in the air and more like something trapped inside the house, waiting. The first unnerving moment wasn't a sight or a sound, but the sheer weight of the atmosphere, a stillness so absolute, it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. We had rented the place for a week, needing a base for a friend's wedding. The townhome was located on one of Savannah's moss-draped squares, a beautiful, aging structure built in the 1890s. The photos had shown antique furniture, dark wood, and a small walled courtyard. The reality was darker, dustier, and strangely silent. The first floor was a museum of forgotten things, heavy draperies perpetually drawn against the sunlight. We were staying on the second floor, a cozy bedroom with a 4-poster bed. Our host, a woman named Eliza, had left a note with explicit instructions, almost all of which centered on the basement. "Please do not, under any circumstances, use the basement door. It is locked and houses old utilities that are not safe for guests. If the main floor feels chilly, do not adjust the thermostat. The drafts are normal for a home of this age." The warning was overly strict, a sudden, jarring note of paranoia in an otherwise hospitable setting, and it was the first crack in the veneer of normalcy. The normalcy began to peel away completely on the second night. The drafts Eliza mentioned were more than just cool air. They were currents that moved objects. I'd wake up to find the book I was reading on the bedside table had been moved to the foot of the bed, or a curtain pushed aside that I distinctly remember drawing shut. My wife, Sarah, was the first to experience something truly unsettling. She was washing her face in the bathroom when she noticed it. The mirror. It was an antique, large, and dark rim. She said that for a split second. The reflection in the glass was not the bathroom she was standing in, but a different room, a cavernous, low-ceilinged space, lit by a single, flickering gas lamp. The reflection contained two figures, both indistinct, but their heads were tilted, looking at where her reflection should have been. She blinked, and it was gone, replaced by the familiar reflection of the tile and the towel rack. Later, as I lay in bed, unable to shake the oppressive silence, I heard a sound from the main floor below. It wasn't footsteps. It was the sound of something being dragged. A slow, steady thud that seemed to originate from the center of the first floor, moving in a deliberate path toward the back of the house right where the forbidden basement door was located. The dragging sound became a nightly occurrence, a clockwork haunting that we tried desperately to ignore. We put towels under our bedroom door, turned on a fan, and cranked up white noise apps, but the low-frequency scrape always penetrated the defenses. The psychological pressure mounted until it became unbearable. We stopped sleeping and started snapping at each other. The smell, which we had initially ignored, now seemed to pulsate, stronger at night, overwhelming during the day. It was metallic now, like old blood mixed with the sweetness. The breakthrough, and the true horror, came when I finally went downstairs to confront the source of the noise. It was 3 a.m. The dragging had started, and this time, it sounded closer, louder, almost right beneath our floor. I crept down the dark, carpeted staircase. I was standing in the main living room, the air thick and cold, straining to listen. The sound stopped. Everything was silent. I used my phone flashlight and shined it toward the back corner where the basement door was located. It was a heavy, unmarked wooden door, sealed with an antique brass latch. But what caught my attention was the floorboards directly in front of the door. They were slightly scraped, the dark finish worn down in a pattern of parallel scratches, consistent with something heavy being repeatedly dragged from the center of the room, across the floor, and up to that door. And right next to the door, sitting neatly on the floor, was a small, rusted, brass bell, the kind a butler would use. My heart hammering, I didn't touch the bell. I realized the host's warning wasn't just about the safety of the utilities. It was about the occupancy of the basement. The dragging sound wasn't someone dragging something into the basement, but something dragging itself to the door. I backed away, my flashlight illuminating the antique furniture and dark portraits. And then I saw it. On the heavy mahogany mantel, sitting amongst the dust and antique clutter, was a new item. It wasn't a picture or a vase. It was a single, small, hand-painted porcelain doll, dressed in the style of the late 1800s. Its eyes were wide, and its mouth was fixed in a painted smile. I knew, with sickening certainty, that it hadn't been there yesterday. As I stared at the doll, the brass bell on the floor near the basement door began to rock. It didn't ring it, simply tipped slowly back and forth, tink-tink, tink-tink, against the polished wood, as if something invisible had nudged it, testing its balance. Then, a low, wet sigh issued from behind the heavy wooden door, a sound of profound relief, like a person finally settling down to rest after a terrible exertion. I didn't try to reason or explain. I just grabbed Sarah, who was already awake and trembling, and shoved our essentials into our bags. We were out of that house and speeding down the street in under 5 minutes, leaving the rest of our belongings behind. We called Eliza from the first town we reached, demanding a refund and telling her about the noises and the doll. She cut me off before I could finish. She didn't sound angry or surprised. She sounded utterly defeated. "The house requires things," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It needs to be shown that people are willing to acknowledge it. If you acknowledge it, it quietens down. If you don't, it becomes more persistent." She hung up. We never got the full refund or our clothes back. A month later, out of morbid curiosity, I looked up the listing. It was gone. Instead, I found an old Savannah newspaper, clipping from 1898. It detailed the disappearance of a wealthy family's young maid. Her name was Eliza. She was last seen near the family's rear stairwell, near the entrance to the servants' quarters and the utilities room. A reward was offered for the return of her favorite toy, a hand-painted porcelain doll. I often wonder what the new occupants of that Airbnb are trying so desperately to ignore, and what terrible new things the house is requiring now that the door has been opened for the next tenant. It's been 8 months since I last slept with the lights off, and it all started with a simple, peeling plastic keycard. That room number 117 felt less like a temporary stay, and more like a carefully baited trap. The moment I inserted the card, and the cheap lock clicked, a profound coldness that had nothing to do with the air conditioning washed over me. I'm a traveling salesman for office supplies, and I've seen hundreds of motel rooms from California to Maine, but this one, nestled somewhere off I-80 in rural Nevada, was different. It didn't just feel old, it felt used up by something that should never have been there. My territory had me driving cross-country, and on this particular night, I pulled into the desert sands in a relic with a sun-bleached sign and a pool that was less water and more green sludge. The check-in was handled by a woman behind a thick, yellowed plexiglass shield who barely looked up. She gave me the key and pointed a chipped nail toward the wing furthest from the highway. Inside, room 117 was the epitome of budget travel. Two queen beds with polyester spreads, a TV bolted to the dresser, and a window overlooking the empty asphalt lot. I dropped my briefcase and laptop bag, the thud echoing in the strange, dead air of the room. I planned to get 6 hours of sleep and be back on the road by dawn. The first sign that something was off was the mirror. It wasn't cracked, but it had a strange, milky spot, like a thumbprint pressed into the glass from the inside, high up where no one would normally touch. I wiped it, but the discoloration seemed to be beneath the surface. It was a detail I tried to dismiss as poor maintenance. I was scrolling through my emails when the television started cycling channels. Not a full channel change, but a quick, silent flicker from the news to static, to a cooking show, then back. I picked up the remote and pressed the power button hard, silencing the box. An hour later, I was trying to fall asleep in the bed, closer to the door. The traffic noise outside had died down to almost nothing. That's when the scratching started. It wasn't the sound of mice in the walls. It was too precise, too measured. It came from the wall shared with the room next door, 118, and it sounded like someone dragging a single, long fingernail across the wallpaper, slow and deliberate, a single pass every few minutes. I eventually knocked on the wall and yelled, "Hey, keep it down, please." The scratching stopped instantly. I figured I had annoyed a late-night traveler. But the next sound was worse, a faint, wet sniffing from directly under the air conditioning unit near the window. It sounded deep and labored, like an animal or a person struggling to draw a breath. I held my own breath, listening hard, and the sniffing continued for perhaps a minute, then faded. By this point, sleep was impossible. I lay there, heart pounding, listening for any repetition. Around 3 a.m., as the room was completely silent and cast in the pale orange glow of the parking lot light, I saw movement, not in the room itself, but reflected in that strange, milky spot on the mirror. A shape, tall and thin, stood just at the periphery of my vision, at the foot of the other bed. It was indistinct, but it wasn't a shadow. It was something. I whipped my head around to look, but nothing was there. The room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the milky spot was gone. In its place, the condensation of a single, slow droplet tracked down the glass from top to bottom, like a tear. I bolted upright, grabbing my phone and shining the flashlight beam toward the foot of the second bed. Nothing but the polyester bedspread. I began to sweat. I started checking the room, the bathroom, the closet, the door chain, but it was all locked and normal. I went back to the bed, phone still clutched in my hand, and tried to rationalize. Fatigue, a bad dinner, the isolation. I closed my eyes and tried to force myself to breathe. The moment my eyes were shut, I heard the keycard slot near the door chirp once, a sound the lock makes when a key is successfully read, but the door chain was still on. Then it chirped again, and again, slowly, rhythmically. The lock kept engaging and disengaging. Click chirp, as if someone was patiently standing outside, repeatedly trying to enter the room, even though they knew the chain was set. The rhythm of the lock mechanism became a frantic, terrifying pulse. I knew, with absolute certainty, that whatever was on the other side of that cheap wooden door was not a person who had the wrong room. The attempts at entry became more aggressive. Not just the electronic chirp, but a rattling of the doorknob, a forceful, impatient jiggle. I snatched my laptop and my phone, my briefcase forgotten, and dove into the bathroom, slamming the flimsy door and locking it. I stood on the toilet seat, pressing myself against the cool, tile ceiling, trying to be as small and silent as possible. The heavy, insistent jiggling and rattling stopped instantly. For a single, horrifying second, there was total silence. Then, a voice, a whisper so dry and close, it felt like it was inhaled directly into my ear, filtered through the thin bathroom ventilation fan. It wasn't loud, but it was deep and gravelly, the sound of dust being spoken. You shouldn't have seen the mirror. I didn't wait. I stayed perfectly still until I heard the distinct sound of the plastic keycard being slid back into its reader, followed by the electronic clunk of the lock disengaging. Then the sound of the door slowly, heavily swinging open. I heard heavy, wet footsteps cross the main room, pause briefly at the foot of my bed, and then continue directly toward the bathroom door. I heard the knob slowly turn, followed by a heavy push against the locked wood. I squeezed my eyes shut, preparing for the splintering wood, but the door held. Then, the silence returned, heavier and more complete than before, only broken by the faint sound of the traffic outside, slowly picking up pace as morning approached. I waited until the first sliver of weak, gray dawn light bled through the bathroom window before I crept out. The motel room door was ajar, the chain hanging limp. My briefcase was overturned, and scattered across the carpet was every single one of my office supply samples, pen, pads, highlighters, all neatly laid out in a perfect, unsettling circle, centered on the milky spot from the mirror, which had now fully returned, larger and darker. I left the laptop, the phone, the keys, and the job. I ran out the door, got in my car, and drove straight east until the sun was high in the sky. To this day, I can still hear that dry, quiet voice whenever a lock clicks a certain way. I never called the company. I never checked my bank account, and I never spent another night in a motel. The thing about the Three Palms Motel in rural Louisiana was that it had history, the kind that smelled like mold and regret. We weren't there for a vacation. We were there for the money. My crew, and I myself, a photographer named Marcus, and an audio guy, Pete, had booked the entire bottom floor for a week. We were ghost hunters, or rather, skeptics, who filmed high-production paranormal investigations for a major streaming service. We debunked far more than we confirmed, but the goal was the atmosphere, the audience's hunger for the unknown. This motel, built in the 1950s, on what was rumored to be the site of a mass grave from a forgotten swamp fever outbreak, was supposed to be our masterpiece of debunking. We had set up our base of operations in room 104, a space barely bigger than a walk-in closet, with 2 single beds and a persistent smell of chlorine and decay. We spent the first day setting up miles of infrared cable, thermal cameras, and electromagnetic field detectors across the wing. The key location was the back corner room, 110, which the locals claimed had been sealed off for 2 decades after a series of incidents. The motel owner, a stoic man named Roy, had reluctantly given us the key, but his eyes held a strange, sad warning. "Don't open the door until sunrise," he'd said, and no further explanation was offered. We had a professional mandate to enter at midnight. The normalcy we established was our routine, checking levels, calibrating equipment, and joking about the stale cigarette smoke clinging to the curtains. But the sense of wrongness was immediate. When we unrolled the cables across the carpet in the hallway, they wouldn't lie straight. They kept curling back, always slightly pointing toward the sealed door of room 110, as if drawn by a subtle, unseen current. As darkness fell over the bayou, the atmosphere outside the motel became thick and silent, save for the occasional, unsettling pop of gas escaping the nearby swamp. We were in room 104, monitoring the feeds, waiting for the clock to hit 12. The cameras in the hallway were showing nothing but the empty, peeling paint. Around 11:30 p.m., the first escalation began with the sound. It was coming from the floor above us, a rhythmic, heavy dragging noise, like something immensely weighty being pulled across bare wood. We checked our paperwork. The second floor was completely vacant, shut down for repairs. We all looked up. Pete was the first to speak. "It's got to be the foundation settling, the old plumbing." But the sound wasn't random. It would drag, pause, and then drag again, always toward the far end of the hallway, directly above room 110. Marcus grabbed his camcorder and headed out to the stairwell. But when he opened the door, the sound vanished, replaced by a dense, suffocating silence. He came back pale. "The air up there," he whispered. "It felt like breathing water." When we returned to the monitor, the digital clock on the screen for the room 108 hallway camera room 2 doors down from us had suddenly jumped ahead by 32 minutes. But the time on all the other cameras was correct. A temporal glitch we couldn't explain. At midnight, we grabbed our gear and headed toward the notorious room 110. The air in the hallway was noticeably colder, near the door, a temperature drop of almost 15 degrees according to our thermal gun. We inserted the key into the lock of room 110. As the tumbler clicked, the lights in the entire wing, not just our hallway, but the outdoor parking lot lights too, snapped off. Total, suffocating darkness. We switched to infrared. The 3 of us stood frozen. From inside room 110 we heard a sound, not a dragging, but a series of distinct, heavy drops, like large chunks of meat hitting the wooden floor, 5 or 6 times. Thud, thud, thud. I pushed the door open, the old wood scraping against the carpet. The room was not empty. It was filled floor-to-ceiling with thousands of folded, identical pieces of white laundry, stacked in perfect, neat columns. Not clothing, but squares of fabric, like towels or napkins. In the center of the room, standing atop the highest column, was a figure. It was impossibly tall and gaunt, hunched over the fabric pile. Its skin was the color and texture of dried clay, and its eyes were enormous, black, and wet, reflecting our infrared light like 2 perfect voids. It was slowly, methodically, folding another piece of the white cloth. It didn't look up, but its head cocked slightly, acknowledging our presence. We stood in the doorway, paralyzed, staring at this impossible being in this impossible room of white cloth. Then, the rhythmic folding stopped. The thing extended one long skeletal arm and pointed its index finger, stiff and unnatural, at the floor right in front of us. I looked down, and illuminated only by the faint glow of my camera screen, I saw them, 5 or 6 perfect, red-brown stains, the color of old, dried blood, soaking into the top layer of the clean white cloths, right where the drops had sounded. Marcus screamed, a raw, choking sound, and bolted. Pete stumbled back, dropping his audio recorder. I couldn't move. My eyes locked on the clay-skinned figure. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the rapid, gasping breath I realized was my own. The creature in the pile of laundry made no sound. It simply turned its head, slowly, until those massive black eyes were fixed on mine. The profound ancient sadness I saw in those eyes was worse than any aggression. It wasn't menacing us, it was simply waiting. As I finally found the strength to turn and run, stumbling out of the room, I heard the door click shut behind me. The lights in the entire motel wing flickered back on instantly. I caught up to my crew, who were already tearing down the cables in a panicked frenzy. We left everything else, all the cameras, the laptops, the evidence inside room 104. We didn't even check out. The last image I saw, before peeling out onto the highway, was the faint, reddish light bleeding from under the sealed door of room 110. I never told the network exactly what we found. The story we aired was just a simple, unconfirmed EMF reading. But every night, I still hear the imagined thud of those wet drops, and I know that whatever lives in that sealed room is still there, patiently folding its endless supply of clean, white cloth, just waiting for the next stain. It started with the smell. Not a bad smell, exactly, but one that was profoundly wrong. The smell of fresh, damp earth, mixed with an overpowering sweetness, like lilies left in a closed room for days. I smelled it the moment I walked into the lobby of the Ponderosa Pines Motor Lodge, a roadside stop deep in the Redwood National Park area of Northern California. I was driving up to Seattle to interview for a new tech job, and had decided to take the scenic route through the giant trees, enjoying the isolation. This motel, advertised vaguely as a historic landmark, looked like a collection of dilapidated, rustic cabins bolted together, surrounded by the kind of imposing, shadowy woods that swallow all light and sound. The woman at the desk, no, older than 20, but with eyes that looked 100, didn't ask for ID or a credit card. She simply handed me a heavy brass key stamped cabin 7 and told me, in a voice that was eerily flat, "The well water's cold. Don't run the shower too long." That unsettling interaction was the first thread pulled. Cabin 7 was small, dark, and smelled powerfully of that sweet, cloying dirtan flower scent. It was clearly a single occupancy cabin, with one twin bed pushed into the corner. A small, framed watercolor of the surrounding forest hung crookedly over the bed. I checked the bathroom. The well water was indeed icy and smelled strongly of iron. I told myself the smell was just the humidity and the old wood of the cabin. But as I settled in, I noticed that the light coming through the single, dusty window wasn't just dim, it was strangely fractured, as if the air itself inside the cabin was somehow denser, almost shimmering. The unsettling quiet of the redwoods pressed against the thin walls. I tried to distract myself by unpacking, but every movement felt amplified, intrusive. Then, the sounds began. Faint at first, they seemed to come from the crawl space beneath the floorboards. A soft rhythmic drumming, like knuckles gently tapping wood, only muffled by the earth below. I got down on my hands and knees and pressed my ear to the floor, but the tapping stopped instantly. I stood up, dismissed it as movement in the old structure, and went to turn on the small, ancient television. As I did, I glanced at the watercolor on the wall. I distinctly remember the painting showing a man standing at the edge of the woods, looking away from the cabin. But now, the tiny figure in the painting was turned around. It was still blurry, still a watercolor, but it was facing the cabin, and it was wearing a faded, green shirt that perfectly matched the one I had just taken out of my bag and laid on the bed. My heart began to beat against my ribs like a trapped bird. I backed away slowly, staring at the painting, trying to rationalize a shift in memory or poor light. But as I watched, The figure in the frame seemed to lean slightly forward. The drumming started again, louder this time, not from beneath the floor, but from behind the thin plank wood wall shared with the bathroom. It wasn't the wall of the shower or the toilet. It was the wall directly behind the mirror. The sweet smell of lilies and damp soil was now so intense it made my eyes water. I reached out a trembling hand and touched the crooked frame of the painting. The brass hook holding it was slightly damp. I gripped the frame, intending to rip it off the wall, but as my fingers curled around the molding, the image in the watercolor changed again. The figure was now halfway out of the frame's landscape. His arms stretched toward the foreground, his painted face blurred but unmistakably staring directly at me through the glass, and the green shirt was now a stark, brilliant red. I stumbled back, tripping over my duffel bag, my breath catching in my throat. The muffled drumming behind the mirror was replaced by a quick, scraping sound, like stone on bone. Suddenly, the bathroom light, the one I hadn't turned on, flickered once. I could hear a wet, gulping sound coming from the drain of the sink, a sound that implied something too large was trying to pull itself up the pipe. Paralyzed between the creeping dread behind the mirror and the impossible horror in the drain, I looked toward the door. The heavy brass key for cabin 7, which I had placed on the small, rickety desk, was no longer there. In its place was a single fist-sized clod of fresh black earth. The cloying floral scent was overwhelming now. The figure in the painting was no longer recognizable as human. It was a smear of colors and shapes, pressing hard against the glass, the wood of the frame audibly groaning under the pressure. The only thing distinct was the red splash of its shirt. The scraping behind the mirror stopped. Everything went dead silent. Then, a single, clear drop of water, thick and rust-colored, slid down the surface of the watercolor's glass. Simultaneously, the brass key for cabin 7 was violently flung across the room, hitting the wall opposite me with a deafening, metallic clatter and landing near the foot of the bed. It wasn't thrown from the direction of the desk or the bathroom. It seemed to have been thrown from the center of the room, through the impossible density of the air. I didn't grab the key. I didn't grab my bag. I ran out of the cabin and slammed the door shut, hearing a deep, guttural sigh follow me into the rain-slicked night. I didn't stop running until I hit the black asphalt of the highway. I drove 40 miles before I stopped shaking, leaving the car engine idling the whole time. I didn't look in my rearview mirror once. The next day, I called the company and canceled the interview. I had seen the thing in the picture, its hunger made manifest, and I knew that the Ponderosa Pines Motor Lodge wasn't a stopover. It was where they buried you under a shallow layer of dirt and waited for the woods to claim the rest.